Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 15th issue of Chebacco Chats. We're really happy to have Dr. McDonough MacKenzie with us. She's an old friend of the Historical Society. Caitlin is, I'm going to call you Caitlin, because
sounds
we're
good.
old, even though you have a PhD and are a doctor now. But Dr. MacKenzie, Caitlin, has a PhD in, is it botany or biology?
Biology.
Biology, and she studies plant ecology and conservation biology. She is currently completing a David H. Smith Conservation postdoctoral fellowship at UMaine, University of Maine, and is starting as a visiting assistant professor of history at Colby College this semester. And we're going to talk about her work, so I want to get right into it. But let's see, I've got a couple of pictures to share with you, so let's get there. All right. I don't know why this step always takes me a minute. Here we go.
All right.
Looking good?
Mm-hmm.
Now, normally, a real webinar would have an engineer running this side of things, but I think now we can just talk.
Mm-hmm.
At last. So your article was published in the 2015 issue of Chebacco, the annual journal of the Mount Desert Islands Historical Society. And I think that you've been very, very busy since then. So we're not only looking forward to having you recap your article, but also catch us up on what you've been doing since then, and the answer is a lot, and we'd love to get to the detail. But we want to visit a happy memory with the marathon team. Yep. I forget what year this might have been. It might have been 2015.
Yeah, I think it was 2015 or 2014.
2014.
Yeah.
And there's Brooke Minner and Hannah Stevens and Caitlin, and you were running something like a 9-minute mile for the marathon, as I recall.
We were the relay team, so I made them come out of the crowd, which is why they have jackets on. They didn't wear jackets on their legs, but I made them come out of the crowd to finish, all three of us together, because they had finished their legs earlier in the day. And
your team name was?
Her Story.
Get it? Well, that's great, and we really appreciate your long association with the Historical Society. Let's talk about your article, The Changing Flora of Mount Desert Island. First of all, can you read a segment from it for us?
Sure. So I'm going to read from the middle of it, and I'll just use Edward Rand's full name the first time I mention him. So it is possible to visit the places where Edward Rand studied, to hold his herbarium specimens in your hand, and to retrace his steps across Mount Desert Island. The Champlain Society kept detailed logbooks recording their summer adventures, and these are studded with descriptions of botanizing trips. On August 25th, 1882, soon after breakfast, great energy seizes Bates, Jones, and Rand. They walked along the dusty road to Hadlock's Upper Pond, thence through the woods to the foot of the Sargent Mountain Gorge. At the logging camp, the party separated. Rand roamed through the woods in search of new plants for some time, finally arriving at the waterfall where Bates and Jones had promised to meet him. As he found no trace of them there, he climbed one of the peaks of Sargent and feasted on blueberries. On the summit of the peak, he fell in with Gardner's famous trail and attempted to follow it. My own fieldwork leads me across Sargent Ridge twice a week in spring and summer. I often think about Rand's field attire, the canvas and wool field clothes, the tin vasculum for carrying new specimens, as I race along in trail runners, synthetic wicking layers and polar fleece, and Primaloft installation. In 1892, in a short essay titled How I Botanize, Southwest Harbor summer resident Annie Sawyer Downs outlines her own packing list for botanical fieldwork. And aside from the plain skirt, short and full, it seems likely that Rand would have carried a similar kit. The things I provide myself with when I go botanizing are a pocket knife, a pair of scissors and a case, a little ball of soft string and a tin box, which is carried by a strap over my shoulder. I wear a plain skirt, short and full, a round hat with a rim wide enough for shade, a pair of strong gloves with gauntlets, and shoes of sensible thickness, with broad soles and low heels.
That's a wonderful picture. And what time of year does that memory go back to? Is that in the summer?
Yeah, so Edward Rand would be botanizing pretty much all summer long they usually arrived in June. A couple of years they did from July through August. And I was up there starting in 2011. From 2011 I came in May, but every other year that I was doing my dissertation work, I would arrive in April and stay through the 4th of July.
Well, tell us then, what's the essence of your article? What's it about?
So Edward Rand and his colleagues put together this really beautiful 1894 book called The Plants of Mount Desert Island, Maine, or The Flora of Mount Desert Island, Maine, sorry. In 2010, Glenn Middlehauser and his colleagues put together The Plants of Acadia National Park. And when I arrived as a, early graduate student in 2011, The Plants of Acadia National Park had just come out. And in that volume, they had come up with a list of the plants that were locally extirpated, so no longer found on Mount Desert Island, that had been in the historical record. But they didn't trace changes in abundance besides just the loss of species. So they didn't have a really clear understanding of how many species had declined in abundance, which species were increasing in abundance, species that had held steady. And so I got this project of comparing the 1894 flora to the 2010 flora. And I got to jump into a little bit of historical work, which I was not a historian at all. I'm pretty much a plant ecologist, but it was really fun to kind of get into the archives a little bit and try to understand these plants from a very different perspective. And just like Rand kind of built himself a family of other botanists who were working on Mount Desert Island, I got to work with Glenn Middlehauser and the other authors of The Plants of Acadia National Park, and found a really wonderful community of people who were so generous with their time and their expertise, and really shared their data with me to allow me to do that comparison.
And did you come up with this concept of comparing the historical record to the modern record and noting the difference? Is this something that you did uniquely, or is there a extensive literature that follows that pattern?
There's a little bit of a literature, especially in New England. It's called floristic change, and New England is, a very lucky place to study that, because there's this wealth of historical botanists who were out cataloging the flora in the late 19th and early 20th century. And botanists today can go look at their records and try to recreate their studies to see what has changed on the landscape. So when I talk about floristic change, I often say it's like you're trying to understand a makeover. You have the before picture, which is the historical flora, and you have the after picture, the survey that you have today. And from those two pictures, you're trying to recreate what the makeover actually was and understand how these plants have changed over time.
So your baseline is the work of Edward Lothrop Rand.
Yes.
Who was he? Who was he?
He was not a professional botanist. He came to Mount Desert Island in 1880 as just a kid who was a Harvard undergraduate who was hanging out with his friends, and they said, let's all do some natural history on Mount Desert Island this summer. One of them, their parents were in Europe for the summer and left the yacht behind. So they got on the yacht and they sailed up the coast and went to Somme Sound and camped out. And they called themselves the Champlain Society, and they made a flag for themselves, and they kept these log books. And everyone had a different job within the Champlain Society, and Edward Rand was the botanist. And he just really seemed to love it. And he seemed to love the kind of community of other people that were also studying plants. And he really made an effort to reach out to other botanists on the island. And so the two other people who are pictured here, John Redfield and Annie Sawyer Downs, they were both middle-aged. I would say actually John Redfield was pretty elderly. He was retired. And Edward Rand was a college kid who just kind of like made friends with them. And Rand kept coming back as he graduated from Harvard College, while he was a law student at Harvard, while he opened up a practice in Boston. And he came back for 14 years to continue that fieldwork and put together his Flora of Mount Desert Island, Maine, which is a really incredible book. The correspondence that I got to read in the archives at the Harvard Herbarium of people who wrote letters to Rand after it was published, there were just botanists from around the country that were just writing these really beautiful congratulatory letters to Rand. It seemed like he had really put together something very special.
And you, I think one of the fun things about the way you've written your article is that you see some parallels between you and your life, your profession, and Rand. You say, the landmarks of Edward Rand's story are sturdy places. Mm-hmm. What did you mean by that?
Both in terms of the natural landmarks, like you can kind of follow where he was through the logbooks. He went to Sargent Mountain, and I go to Sargent Mountain all the time, but you can also go to the places where his botanical career was really shaped. So he talks about the Champlain Society starting in a dorm room in Harvard Yard. And I'm currently just hanging out in Boston during the pandemic, and I walk over to Harvard Yard all the time and walk by that dorm. The same with places like Astiku Inn. There was a summer where they decided that they wanted to have all of their meals at the Astiku Inn. So the Champlain Society had their tents down by the Sound, and then they would walk up and have meals. And I remember the field seasons where I would drive by all the time, have popovers there occasionally. And it's just kind of this sense that there are some places where you can almost travel back in time and reimagine the landscape as Rand saw it.
And I guess as a botanist, you're able to do that maybe to a degree that many people are not, because you really recognize the ground cover and the tree species that were present then and are present now.
Yeah, I wrote in the article about Annie Sawyer Downs was botanically famous for finding a white Rhodora plant, and most Rhodora is purple. And so I remember reading Rand talk about the white Rhodora in the Flora of Mount Desert Island and thinking, well, I've never heard of that. It's probably locally extinct. And then there was one summer where I was hiking on Sargent Mountain and I found a patch of white Rhodora. And that was a moment of feeling like, oh, I can see the same plant that these folks got to see in the late 19th century.
Yeah. So tell us, how did you conduct your field work? What did that process look like? Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I was really lucky in that I arrived on Mount Desert Island right when the plants of Acadia National Park had been published. And my mentors in the Park Service and Glenn Middlehauser were kind of looking for someone to take that next step and put together the comparison of the flora of Mount Desert Island from 1894 to the plants of Acadia National Park in 2010. And Rand's flora included not just the list of every plant that was on the island, but also how abundant it was in the 19th century. And then the plants of Acadia National Park has every plant in Acadia National Park, and then how abundant it is on a kind of really simple 4-point scale. So I could take Rand's very Victorian descriptions of abundance and put them into those 4 categories, and then look at how they had changed over time. But the field work that I was doing, where I got to hike outside and see these plants up close, was looking at the timing of their leaf out and their flowering, and to see how that had changed, or how it changes in response to changing spring temperatures. And then we looked at, for example, with this slide, we looked at if there were certain habitats on the island that were losing species more rapidly than others. So was this a case where we had seen a lot of species that were locally extirpated, and maybe it was all grassland species, because in the century since Rand's Flora, all of these open grasslands that were kind of cultural landscapes, it became a national park. No one was cutting them and mowing them, so the forest succession grew back in. But it turns out that all of these habitats are losing species pretty equally. So because there's not a really clear habitat connection, that points to there being a larger regional or global driver of some of these plant species losses.
In other words, a lot of your research pointed to climate change.
Yeah, climate change, changes in atmospheric deposition, just kind of really large scale things. It wasn't a case where we could look at any one species that had been lost from the island and say, well, that was deer over browsing, or that was something really specific about local development here. It seemed to be a much larger pattern happening on a regional to global level.
Well, it also seems that Annie Sawyer Downs plays an important part in your story. Tell us about her.
Sure. She was a summer resident in Southwest Harbor. She was a school teacher in her normal life, but she was also a botanical enthusiast. And so she wrote a lot about botanizing and about plants, both on Mount Desert Island and back in the Boston area where she was from. And she had actually grown up in Concord, Massachusetts, where she learned about botany from a guy named Henry David Thoreau. Oh, wow. And so her kind of spark for being interested in plants seemed to be following Thoreau around Concord and botanizing with him. And here she is, it's the 1880s and she's in her 40s. And she's got a pretty good reputation for being a botanist at this point. And this college kid named Edward Rand approaches her and says, I'm trying to put together a catalog of every plant on the island. Can you help me out? And basically, throughout the flora of Mount Desert Island, there's one person who's cited more than anybody else who's not, I mean, Edward Rand obviously cited a lot, it's his book, but Annie Sawyer Downs is like the most prolific assistant in that process. And she's not left behind a lot of other information. So it was interesting kind of to track down her mystery and try to figure out if she had left behind field books, if there were these like stacks of notebooks that would be a really incredible resource. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what Annie Sawyer Downs was doing and where she kept her notes and her collections. And ultimately, I actually didn't find anything. The only time that I've seen her handwriting is on her herbarium specimens. And her herbarium specimens at the Harvard Herbarium are packaged together with Edward Rand's in a big group that came from the New England Botanical Club, which he went on to found, and which women were not allowed to participate in. Although I believe Annie died right before the club began, so she couldn't have been a member anyway. But it seems like from that evidence that Annie gave her specimens to Rand, who eventually donated all of them to the New England Botanical Club. So their botanical legacies are tied up together very closely. And it just struck me as this like really clear metaphor for how women in science kind of struggled to leave a mark on their work at the end of the 19th century.
Well, just as there are parallels between your professional interest and Rand, I pick up from other sources. You're very active on Twitter and so forth, and I am following what you have to say, and it sounds like you sort of draw a parallel between Annie Sawyer Downs and her efforts to participate in the world of science and your aspirations to do the same. Mm-hmm. Is that right, that you kind of feel like there's a kinship with her as well?
Yeah, I call Annie my 19th century girlfriend because I just so admire the work that she did with Edward Rand and the writing that she left behind. Similarly, Kate Furbish was a botanist in Maine who also never formally studied botany in graduate school. But when I was reading the archives left behind by Edward Rand, there's a note from Kate Furbish to Rand congratulating him on the book. And at that point, I was like, oh, this must be a really good book if Kate Furbish really liked it. So Annie Sawyer Downs and Kate Furbish were kind of my patron saints of my work. And here's another Annie Sawyer Downs fan.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Who do we have here? Who's this?
This is Mara. You have to go. Thank you.
Hi, Mara. Okay, so let's tell us about the changes that you found. Let's get to the heart of your work.
You have to be quiet. Okay. So let's talk about.
This is one of the challenges you.
Yeah.
This is the world.
Work from home.
Yeah, this is the world we're all dealing with. So we're happy to have you both.
All right. What's the question on floristic change? What are overall results?
Yes. Yeah. Let's get to the heart of your findings. We talked about your approach, the historical background, its context, your field work. Now tell us what you discovered.
We found there were 730 species that were recorded in Rand's Flora, and 106 of those are no longer found on the island. So that's a species loss of almost 16% of that original flora, which is really high for a place that's been a national park now for a century. And when we compared it to other floristic change studies across the region, it kind of sticks out as a pretty middle of the road species loss rate, which is surprising for a place that has a history as a national park. It's pretty similar to places like Concord, Massachusetts and Worcester, Massachusetts, which are, urban and suburban areas.
So you're showing us in the slide the Canada lily and the low spike rush. Mm-hmm. Are those extirpated species?
Those were both found by Rand and are no longer on Mount Desert Island.
Do they continue to show up north of here? Is the species migrating to the north?
So we actually didn't find a connection between the kind of range of the species, whether they're northern or southern, and their extirpation rate on the island, which I was really surprised by. That would have been a clear sign of climate change driving these range shifts. And instead, there doesn't seem to be a difference between the northern species and the southern species. So you can still find both of these species in Maine. Okay.
Well, I want to invite our viewers to ask questions if you're on Zoom through the Q&A function, or if you're looking on Facebook, we can look at see your questions there, and we would love to hear from you. And while we're waiting for questions to show up, Caitlin, tell us what is Edward Rand's legacy?
I think Edward Rand's legacy is obviously his book, but even after his book was published in 1895 or 1894, he went on to be one of the founding members of the New England Botanical Club. So there was really something about doing botanical work, but also finding a community of other people who enjoyed looking for plants and studying plants with you. He was never a professional botanist. He studied law and worked as a lawyer, and this was kind of his side passion. And my husband, who you might have seen dragging Mara out of here, he's a lawyer. And so we often talk about how the two of us together make one Edward Rand, where I do the botany side of things and he's a lawyer, and we can't imagine either one of us possessing all of those talents and skills. So he was just a really incredibly well-rounded guy. But I think ultimately his legacy is botanists finding community with each other, either through the New England Botanical Club, which still exists. It's a wonderful organization. They actually continue to publish Rhodora, the journal of the New England Botanical Club, where I ended up publishing this study last year. And I think his legacy is about people finding each other around plants.
And how about yourself? Where are you headed in your scientific pursuits? What's next for you've taken this study for a long ride, haven't you?
Yes. Yeah, this was probably the first thing I started working on as a PhD student, and really the last thing that I actually got published from my PhD. It took a long time to put it together. And when I finished all of my dissertation fieldwork in Acadia National Park, I was really looking for a way to keep coming back to Acadia. So I ended up doing this postdoc fellowship at the University of Maine, where I got to return to Sargent Ridge, and this time as a paleoecologist, look at the lake sediment in Sargent Mountain Pond and kind of trace the pollen and the plant macrofossils to reconstruct vegetation at that pond over the last 15,000 years. So as a dissertation project, I was looking at change over the last century, and now my postdoc project looks at millennia. I just can't get away from Acadia National Park, and I'll keep going back in time as long as it takes to stay there.
Well, it's great to have you keep coming back up here. So Jad Roberts asks a question. He says, can any of the lost species be attributed to the 1947 fire?
The only thing that I've heard, and it's really anecdotal, is that mountain laurel used to be on the island, and it used to be in the area on the kind of slope of Cadillac that burned, and it hasn't been seen since the fire. But I actually haven't found any. I've heard that anecdote from a number of people, and I haven't found any like scientific notes to back it up, which doesn't mean that that's not true. But that's the only species that I've heard be tied to the fire itself.
And Jad also poses a question that I think I've been trying to get at too, and kind of looking for a simple answer, but it turns out that things are a little more nuanced.
Yeah.
He asks, is there any one cause for most or much of the loss of species?
There's not one simple cause. And I think what we've ultimately found is Edward Rand left behind the best possible historical data. He left us with this complete catalog. He was really determined that his goal was to catalog all of the flora on the island, and he gave us detailed notes on the abundance. And so when I look at other places that have done floristic change studies, I realize how lucky I am to work with the Rand data set, because it's just like the golden rule for historical data. And even with this really amazing historical data set, we can't pinpoint any one cause for changes in the species or species loss. And I mean, part of that is that we're dealing with so many different stressors and threats to the flora right now. There's the really big picture things like climate change and pollution. There are really small things like individual development projects. And then there's these interconnected things like the pollinators or the seed dispersers for any individual species, which spreads out across a whole food web. And any one little thing that changes in there could have these rippling effects. And for most of these species, it was likely not just one cause. It was a whole mess of different things that played out at once. And I think one of the clear things that we did find is that rare species are more likely to become locally extirpated. So it's important that we monitor and keep track of what's happening with the rare populations on the island, which is something that the Park Service has been working on very seriously.
So a couple of quick final questions.
Mm-hmm.
Ray Cousins asks, is there a memorial to Rand in Acadia National Park?
There is. Well, it's right outside of the park, but it's as you're walking from Jordan Pond down to, I'm actually going to check my article because I named the trail in it. It's the Seaside Path from Jordan Pond to Seal Harbor. And there's this big boulder that has a plaque on it that thanks Rand for his pioneer service and labor of love in making known the flora of Mount Desert, which I think is just a really beautiful memorial to him. And it's off the beaten path. I kind of stumbled onto it by accident the first time I saw it. I didn't know that it existed. So that felt very serendipitous too.
So something for all you explorers to get out there and find. Mm-hmm. And one last question. Jane asks, is the book about the flora of Acadia currently in print and available? If so, where?
The 1894 book, I believe, is not in print. I'm not completely sure about that though. There might be, I have like a soft bound copy that Glenn Middlehauser gave me, and I'm not sure where he got that. I also, one of the really nicest things anyone has ever done for my career is Glenn Middlehauser gave me the Xerox copy of the 1894 Flora that he had used when putting together the plants of Acadia National Park, that has little checks and annotations next to each of the names. So anytime Rand used an old-fashioned name, for example, if he called 3-2 cinquefoil Potentilla Sibaldiopsis, Glenn Middlehauser would like write in next to it and say, this is now Sibaldiopsis potentilla. And so I could kind of like much more easily connect the dots between them. And yeah, I have that annotated copy, which is falling apart on my shelf. It's one of my prized possessions.
It's possible that it's available at archive.org, maybe?
Yeah.
Trust. So I think you can get an electronic version of it online if you go searching for it. Flora of Mount Desert by Edward L. Rand. If you search
there's my parents did give me a one of the copies of the first print that was like in a used bookstore. Like they're around. They're not cheap, but they exist. And the book used to be sold with a really beautiful map of the island. And so if you find a used copy with the map, it's much more expensive.
Well, Caitlin, this half hour went by in a hurry. It's great to see you and talk to you and to see you doing so well. And we're really happy for you.
Thank you.
So folks, next week, join us at same time, 4:30 on Thursday. We'll be talking to Julia Gray, whose article in the 2018 issue of Chebacco was titled John Snow's Postcard Basket, a story of Wabanaki persistence and presence on Mount Desert. She's examining the life of a Wabanaki man who was very much part of the community in the 20th century. It's a fascinating story, and Julia is quite expert and really interesting person to talk to. So please join us then. So that's it for this issue of Chebacco Chats. Thanks for joining us. Caitlin, thanks so much for being with us. Take care, everyone. We'll see you soon.